Hello, welcome to Brief Encounters. I'm Angela Parsons and one of the steering committee co-chairs of the DC Bar's DC Affairs community. The DC Affairs community serves our legal community and follows legal and political issues affecting the District of Columbia. Today, we're going to talk about some incredibly important people and events in DC women's history that led to the 19th Amendment of the United States Constitution. That's the one that confirmed the right to vote for U.S. women. We're so fortunate to be joined today by Kathryn Ray, past president and longtime board member of the League of Women Voters of the District of Columbia, an organization that's close to my heart as well. Kathryn's a native Washingtonian. She received a degree in American Studies at the Mary Washington College of the University of Virginia, a Master's of Library Science from Catholic University, and a Master's of Philosophy in American Civilization with a concentration in DC history from George Washington University. She's currently the reference librarian at American University and has served the district in many capacities over the years, including as librarian with the Brookings Institution, the Washingtoniana Division of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library, and the Tenley Friendship Neighborhood Library. She also served 2 terms as the DuPont Circle ANC Commissioner. Kathryn, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
So before we get started, I wanted to ask a little about your family history. You grew up here, right? How many generations have been in the DC area?
Well, actually, I'm not sure how many, but lots. My family has been in DC area for generations. My dad was actually born on the family farm in the Brightwood neighborhood in Upper Northwest. The farmhouse stood at 2nd and Madison Streets, and my mom's family came in 1914 from Baltimore. My grandfather and his brother owned a shoe store in Columbia Heights. My grandparents bought a new Harry Wardman row house in Brightwood for $1,500 on Longfellow Street, near the end of the streetcar line. So that's how my parents met. They were neighbors. And my one big family history regret is that I never asked either of my grandmothers how they felt when the 19th Amendment passed and they still couldn't vote because they lived in the nation's capital, which is a district, not a state. So the Constitution made no provision for them to be represented in Congress.
Right, and DC statehood is an issue that's very important to this organization as well. So you're well and truly invested in the district, and we'd love to hear that. So it's March, it's Women's History Month, and last spring, the musical Suffs opened on Broadway. It was nominated for 6 Tony Awards, won 2, including for Best Book and Best Score. And it follows a part of the American women's suffrage movement, and particularly this era we're talking about today. It seemed like a perfect time to talk about how the suffrage movement affected the District of Columbia. So first question, do we say suffragists or suffragettes?
Well, Americans preferred the term suffragists or suffs, at least in part to distinguish themselves from the British suffragettes, who were much more militant than the American suffragists. By the way, I was fortunate to see Suffs in New York, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it again when it appears on PBS.
I think it's touring now as well, or will be touring soon this fall. So
well, I hope everyone listening in will see it if they haven't already. I'm going again.
So, many of us are familiar with some of the famous faces in the early suffrage movement, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt. We're going to talk about her a little bit later on. But today we're going to mostly talk about Alice Paul. I'm going to tell you a little background about Alice. Alice was born into a wealthy Quaker family in New Jersey in 1885, and she was interested in women's suffrage early. Her mother was a member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. We're going to talk about them a little more later as well. That was founded in 1890 by Susan B. Anthony, among others. And she'd sometimes join her mother for meetings. And she was very well educated, actually. She received several master's degrees and a PhD. At one point in her education, she went to England to take economics classes at the University of Birmingham. And here she became involved in the Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, Christabel, Adela, and Sylvia. Now, as you were alluding to earlier, the Pankhurst ran a much more radical shop than the Americans. They had gold petitions, they had marches, they regularly incited violent confrontations with authorities. They were arrested, went on hunger strikes, they broke windows, they set buildings on fire, and they threw bombs. They did a lot of damage to get attention to the movement. And Alice participated in some of it, but primarily she learned a lot about civil disobedience from the Pankhursts. One of those things was demanding to be treated as a political prisoner when arrested, because England, like a lot of other European countries, had a special status for political prisoners. And they required better treatment, for one thing. They could wear their own clothes, they weren't put in the general population, and they wouldn't be force-fed in a hunger strike. And this was important because this was a common tactic for the arrested suffragettes. But most importantly, being labeled as a political prisoner sent a message to the public about the legitimacy of what the work the suffragists were doing as a political issue overall. So Alice wasn't actually there that long. She eventually returned to the U.S., and she joins the NAWSA again, then led by Carrie Chapman Catt. Now, how did they get on?
Well, actually, not very well. Alice felt that Mrs. Catt was moving too slowly and was even too polite for Alice's Quaker background. And Mrs. Catt felt that Alice was too brash. She wanted to move too quickly, and their relationship soon was very strained. But Mrs. Catt recognized that Alice was a brilliant strategist and a public relations genius. She conceived of an idea of a grand parade in Washington, D.C. to call attention to the movement. The eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, March 3rd, 1913, was chosen because Alice knew there would be dignitaries from around the country and around the world who would be in town and they would be watching.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about the parade. It was intended to model the suffrage pageants that were held in Britain, but also New York. There was an organization called the Women's Political Union here, and they'd been organizing local marches under the leadership of Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Harriet had married an Englishman, had also become active in the British suffrage campaign while she was over there, and then ended up bringing some of those tactics back to the U.S. So what was the plan for the 1913 march?
Well, the plans were grand. Alice, the sky was the limit for her. Her goal was to have between 5,000 and 10,000 women marching in color coordinated, arranged by their state delegations or their professional delegations. There were to be floats and bands and various groups representing women at home and women at school and women in the workplace. And at the time, these tableaus, as they were called, allegorical scenes, she envisaged one that would be on the steps of the Treasury building, portraying various scenes of patriotism and civic pride. And the finale was to be a rally at the Memorial Continental Hall, later DAR Constitution Hall, with prominent speakers, including Helen Keller. But you can kind of imagine an enterprise of this scale, representing so many disparate groups, because there were suffragist groups all over this country, and they had different goals and different plans and different ideas about whom they represented. So when you had all these disparate groups she was trying to bring together, some dissent was inevitable. And there is one conflict that's received a lot of scrutiny over time, and that was whether Black women would be welcome to march. Now, NAWSA, National American Women's Suffrage Association, had an official policy of suffrage for all women, regardless of race. But the pageant invitees included many groups beyond NAWSA. And there were some groups from the South who threatened to pull out if African Americans were included. Well, this put Alice Paul in an untenable situation because she was a political strategist and she knew she needed the Southern people to be represented because as she wanted to move forward with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, she knew that she was going to need all the help she could get with pressuring the state legislatures of the South to pass the amendment. But on the other side, she was from New Jersey. She was a Nassau person, and I found it unpleasant, this presentation that was given to her of this ultimatum. So she came up with several different ideas about how she might handle it. One was she was going to put the delegation of the men, and I should mention that there were gentlemen for suffrage, for women's suffrage organizations in many states,
Absolutely.
and they were marching in the parade too. And she was going to put them between, as a buffer between the Southern delegations and the other people in the parade. Well, that didn't go over very well. And there was also a newly formed sorority at Howard, and the young women of the sorority wanted to march as well. So she had this competing, what am I going to do? What she eventually did, as far as I can tell, her plan was to say to the Southern delegations, okay, and then told the Howard women to just slip right into the parade, and the famous African suffragist Ida B. Wells, journalist, suffragist, civil rights leader, she just took it upon herself and joined the delegation from Illinois, and off they went. So that's the best I can figure what happened. And then
they had all these grand plans, right? But the parade didn't exactly go smoothly, even once it started either. Right?
Oh, no. She thought maybe that was going to be her worst problem, but indeed it was not. It all started okay. Everybody got organized. The tableau was up on the steps of the Treasury, and the ladies were on horseback, and Inez Mulholland mounted her white stallion to lead off. And they were all color coordinated. They were all marching in unison. But soon confusion reigned. Crowds of men who perhaps had been indulging in a little bit of alcohol to celebrate the inauguration the next day mobbed the parade route. They were pushing and shoving, and the Metropolitan Police declined to intervene, which I think is a really polite way of saying they just didn't care and didn't do anything. Men were pushing and shoving, and some of the women's clothing got torn. It was bedlam. But some people did step in to assist the marchers. And I think it's important to include that the Boy Scouts protected the women, and there were soldiers and members of the Massachusetts and Pennsylvania National Guard stepped in to try to hold off the unruly crowds. And the boys from Maryland Agricultural College, which we now call the University of Maryland, created a human barrier protecting the marchers from the crowd. There was a public outcry because of the violence and the police inaction.
Well, it sounds like it was chaos, but it was a huge success in drawing attention and sympathy to the women's suffrage campaign, right? And Alice capitalized on that for further publicity and support, financial and otherwise.
Absolutely.
And by the way, I wanted to note that the $10 bill has been redesigned. It's not out yet. It's going to be circulated in 2026. But the back is going to include some imagery from the marchers of the parade. That's going to be on the new design when it comes out. So in 1916, Alice split from the other suffrage groups, and she formed the National Woman's Party. And in January 1917, the first of the Silent Sentinels of Liberty began picketing the White House. Can you tell us about the Silent Sentinels and their effect?
Well, way ahead of her time, Alice's plan was that of nonviolent protest. And she was organizing this nonviolent protest about the same time Gandhi was doing it in India, and several decades before Martin Luther King used the same technique. So the women simply stood in front of the White House, holding their banners without uttering a word. They just stood there with their banners. And they really weren't doing anything illegal. But by June, President Wilson had grown very weary of the women and ordered them to be arrested. So their crime,
what's the crime?
Their crime was blocking the sidewalk.
Okay.
And over 500, over time, over 500 arrests were made, and the women would pay their fine and then return to their places in front of the executive mansion and say nothing but have their signs. And that got some attention for a while, but Alice was ready to step up the plan, and she and some of the others refused to pay their fines. So in November of 1917, the police dragged them from out in front of the White House, arrested them in what Alice described as the, quote, night of terror, end quote. And it was. The women were thrown into the rear of a police paddy wagon, which I'm sure was horse-drawn at that point, and driven 20 miles, I'm sure on terrible roads, out into the rural Virginia countryside to the Occoquan workhouse. Now, there's a big rowing venue out there, and I drive out there on I-95 to that venue right by the Occoquan workhouse, and it takes about 30 minutes to drive there on the highway. So I can't imagine what their trip was like in the back of a paddy wagon.
Right.
So when they arrived at the workhouse, they were stripped, given prison gowns, thrown into cells with such force that one woman's arm was broken. And when they refused to eat the rancid food, the police force fed them. Well, back at the National Woman's Party headquarters, those who were not in jail were madly writing press releases and distributing them across the country. Reporters began to question the DC police and the president. And that's at this point is when Alice insisted that the women be referred to as political prisoners.
As she learned from the Pankhursts.
As she learned from the Pankhursts. So the overwhelmingly positive press coverage of the women, just like the chaos of the parade, really helped move the movement's momentum. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson did an about-face and pivoted to endorse votes for women and supported the right of women to vote.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, why did he change his mind?
Well, one of the most unfortunate myths about women's suffrage is that women could not vote before the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, which is not true. Wilson likely changed his mind simply because more women were engaging in the political process and voting. 4 years before the 19th Amendment, the great suffragist Jeanette Rankin of Montana became the first woman elected to the House of Representatives, and that was 4 years before the 19th Amendment. So by 1918, women in 15 Western states enjoyed full voting rights and were actively campaigning for candidates who supported their causes. And the same year that Wilson did his about-face, only 7 states categorically, absolutely denied women the right to vote in any election. Only 7. The other states allowed women to vote in some elections. Like sometimes they were allowed to vote in the presidential election, but not the local election. Sometimes they were allowed to vote in school board, but not this and that. But women were voting, and women with the vote were actively and successfully campaigning against anti-suffrage candidates. So it's really unlikely that Wilson had a change of heart. But he saw the handwriting on the wall and changed his position to save the Democratic Party.
Well, then on June 4th, 1919, a joint resolution of Congress proposing a 19th constitutional amendment was approved. You know, it's only 2 sentences. Would you read it to us?
Oh, I wish everyone would read this. It's only 2 sentences, as Angela says. Section 1, the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Sentence 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
Well, now it goes to the states for ratification. So
Right.
How did that go?
Well, as everyone knows, constitutional amendments require ratification by 3/4 of the state legislatures. So ratification of the 19th Amendment sailed through the states where women had already secured the vote. And by the summer of 1920, they only needed one more state to get the amendment ratified. And the issue was before the legislature of Tennessee.
As a native Tennessean, I really love this story. So,
and if you've ever read Profiles in Courage, it's one that Ted Sorensen included and JFK got the credit for. But the preliminary vote count, the straw vote, was one short of passage of the amendment. But the day of the vote, a young legislator, Harry Byrne, received a letter from his mother saying, and I quote, "Be a good boy," end quote, and vote for Mrs. Catt's ratification. Fortunately for women, he listened to his mom and voted yay. The amendment succeeded. Interestingly, not because of Alice Paul, but because Harry's mom admired Mrs. Carrie Chapman Catt.
Well, so obviously, all women citizens in the United States were now able to vote in the very next election, right? Right?
If it were, the amendment only states that sex cannot be used as a reason for not allowing a citizen to vote. So it's kind of a negative thing. It says you can't use sex for a reason for not allowing the citizen to vote. So it doesn't say all women are now granted the right to vote. It doesn't say all women are secure the right to vote. It doesn't even say women or female. Just says that you can't write a law that says women can't vote. It doesn't guarantee you that you can. And that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Because since there's no guarantee in the amendment, there's no granting, there's no winning, there's no ensured by amendment, nefarious politicians created myriad ways to suppress the votes they didn't want. Many of these methods were already in place due to the negative reactions to the 14th, 15th, 16th Amendments. We know that even though the 19th Amendment is completely colorblind, I read it, there's nothing in there that says only white women can vote or black women can't vote, and he doesn't say anything like that. Politicians devised ways to keep women from voting, and especially preventing African American women from voting. Grandfather type restrictions, literacy tests. They would give a man the equivalent of a Little Dick and Jane to read, and they'd hand the woman War and Peace to read. Poll taxes. Women's finances were controlled by men if they were married. Maybe their husbands wouldn't give them the money they needed to vote. But I think it's really important to make this very clear. The bad guys in all this were the politicians, not the suffragists. So blaming suffragists for actions of politicians is really misplaced. But the 19th Amendment specifically mentions citizens. So it really did not apply to all women in the United States. So additional legislation was needed to press forward with suffrage for all women. Most Native Americans were not deemed citizens until the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. So once they were recognized as citizens, then they were covered women were covered, everyone was covered under the 19th Amendment. And in 1943, the Magnuson Act allowed the Chinese to vote. So there was another group of women that were now covered by the 19th Amendment. And the McCarran-Walters Act conferred citizenship upon Japanese Americans. So that is another group of Americans who were now covered under the 19th Amendment. And then the 24th Amendment abolished poll tax and literacy tests. So that was another big blow to voter suppression. And then we had the 65 Voting Rights Act, which brought in protections for African American voters. But suppression still remained. There was nothing magical about the 1965 Act that, all of a sudden just everybody now could vote, because the suppression remained, as it does today. So each of these actions greatly increased the access for women to the ballot box. But then there's the case of my grandmothers.
As you mentioned.
As
That's
I
right.
mentioned, both of whom lived in Washington, D.C., the 19th Amendment did nothing for them or my grandfathers, even though they were citizens, taxed without representation, but because they resided in the nation's capital, the 19th Amendment did not apply to them.
The Carrie Chapman Catt and the NAWSA would go on to found the nonpartisan League of Women Voters in 1920 in Chicago, and then local and regional branches followed. Now, today, the National League of Women Voters is headquartered here in DC, and there are several regional leagues in the DMV. Now, you and I are members of the District of Columbia League, and that's very active in a number of causes. Would you like to highlight some of the work the league is doing?
Well, we have a very active statehood team who works very closely with organizations across the city and across the country to bring attention to the fact that DC is in many ways still a colony and our individual rights are very much under attack right now. So that's a very important activity. We engage civic education with our schools, and we have generally attempt to help people understand how the district works. We also participate in the nationwide website called vote411.org. Vote and 411. If anybody on this call is old enough to remember what 411 was, that was information you dialed to get information on the old-timey phones. So we are vote411.org, and on that website you can find geographically specific voting information. And about 6 weeks before each election, the local leagues prepare a voter guide, which it's interactive online voter guide where you can type in your address, and we use GIS files to pull your political geography so you can see, which ward you're in, your ANC, your council member, whomever, whichever positions are up for election. And we invite the candidates, to submit a photo and a statement and answer some questions posed by league members. And this is Vote 411 election information is a nationwide initiative of the League of Women Voters. So even if you live in Virginia, there's a Virginia guide. You can tell your cousins in South Carolina to log on to Vote 411 and see who's on the ballot and read about the candidates.
If you're interested in joining the DC League or just attending events, you can go to the website at lwvdc.org. There are annual meetings coming up May 17th. It's a great time to get involved. And also, if you're local and you'd like to learn more about Alice Paul and the suffrage movement, please consider visiting the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument that's located on Capitol Hill, close to Union Station. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much for being here and sharing this really important history.
Well, it's always a pleasure. And if anyone has any follow-up questions for me, my email is vote411 at lwv, like voter, dc.org. So that's vote411lwvdc.org.
And as a reminder to listeners, if you're a local attorney and like this kind of local history or issues of DC home rule and statehood, I'd encourage you to join the DC Affairs community of the DC Bar. Our monthly meetings are at noon on the second Friday of each month. Please reach out to the DC Affairs community if you're interested in attending. On behalf of the DC Affairs community, thank you again, Kathryn Ray, and thanks for listening.